Scripture reading is from John chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. Jesus feeds the 5,000. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs that he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. How far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world."
The phrase, "don't sweat the small stuff," is one that is typically great counsel and pretty much a solid philosophy of life, in the sense that truly trivial things, if they're truly trivial, they should stay that way. Just keep the small stuff small stuff. Don't let mundane matters, don't let minutia or tangential concerns dominate your life or complicate your life or cause you needless stress and frustration in your life. And beyond just a good, solid counsel and philosophy for life, it's a pretty solid counsel for a philosophy of faith as well. There are essentials and there are non-essentials. And in a congregation this large, in a church family this big, I think it's an absolute certainty that there's some diversity among us as to what belongs on what list, what makes that essential list and what makes that non-essential list. And I really don't think that threatens our unity at all, but actually strengthens and enhances and enriches our unity, because we are one in spite of that diversity of thought, that diversity of understanding. But even among those things that we would all agree upon that do matter, not everything matters as much. According to Jesus in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, the tithing of mint and dill and cumin and other household spices, while that was good, while that was noble, while that was admirable, it was simply not as weighty. It wasn't as important. It wasn't as consequential as things like justice and mercy and righteousness. Both expected by God, desired by God, absolutely, but some of those things far more consequential than others. So, true, don't sweat the small stuff, but I fear that general counsel like that might inadvertently create the potential for minimizing, even worse, maybe ignoring the legitimate value of what some people might consider small things. It might inadvertently cause us to forget the positive and powerful impact of things that on the surface maybe might appear to be small and inconsequential. In other words, not everything that looks small is small. I love this phrase that says, little hinges swing big doors. The next door you approach, look at the size of the door, look at the size of the hinge. Hinge is going to be really small. The door may be quite sizable. Now, there's a negative side to this as well. James chapter 3 warns us about that. James says that the tongue is a little hinge that swings some mighty big doors. Just like a tiny rudder directs a big ship, just like a small bit in a horse's mouth can turn the entire large body of that animal, a tiny little spark can ignite a raging forest fire that consumes and destroys. So true, be careful, little lips, what you say, because that little hinge has a lot of power. But this morning I want us to focus on the positive side of small things, what God can do with those things that some people might deem as being insignificant. When those things are placed, and this is the key, when those things are placed under His control, when those things are placed in His hands. The feeding of the 5,000 that James read for us from John's account in John chapter 6. This has the distinction of being the only miracle performed by the hands of Jesus that's recorded in all four Gospels. While there's a lot of similarity among the synoptics and even a little bit of overlap between the synoptics and John, it's amazing that there's only one miracle that gets recorded in all four, and it's this one. Especially when you consult the synoptic accounts in Matthew 14, Mark chapter 6, and Luke chapter 9, you find that this happens at a very critical time in the ministry of Jesus. It follows some great personal discouragement that He is experiencing because of some unsettling news that He has received. The unsettling news is your cousin, your forerunner, the one who pointed to you, the one who baptized you, the one who pointed to you and said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world," he's dead. You knew that he was imprisoned. Herod had his head cut off. And Jesus says to His disciples, "We need to get away. Let's go across the lake." The crowds were ever present, and this was an effort to get some alone time, some quieter time, some space in which to process this tragic loss. And the crowd, as they often did, figured out where He was going so that when He arrives on the other side of the lake, maybe because of a strong headwind, they're there to greet Him when He doesn't want to be greeted, when He doesn't want to be welcomed, when he's not looking for a crowd. And this was a massive crowd. And it's a massive crowd that is suffering need. They've been with Him for a while. They're beginning to get hungry. And when you read the synoptic accounts, you find that they've already assessed the situation and they've said, "Lord, it's getting late. You need to send them away to buy some food." And it's John, and that's why I had James read John's account, because John gives us some details that Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't. He gives us the names of two apostles who are involved in this conversation. Jesus asked Philip, "Philip, got a question for you. Where can we buy bread to feed this crowd?" And Philip's reply was that 200 denarii, 200 days' wages, wouldn't be enough even for each person to have a little. 200 days' wages, that's a little less than 7 months. So just think about 2019, starting out fresh on the new year, January 1, on through the end of this month, on through the end of July, another 2.5 weeks or so. And think about what you've earned during that period. 7 months' wages. You go out and you spend every penny of that on food. And you bring all that mass of food back in however many semis it takes to bring it. And the crowd is so big that all of that food is consumed immediately, and everybody's only had about a half an appetizer each. You could spend that much money and nobody really gets anything to eat. They're going to be as hungry as they were to start with very, very soon. So that's why, in the face of this, the apostles are saying, send them away. This is impossible. It can't be done. And maybe Andrew's motivation in bringing up this boy's sack lunch might have been to say, 7 months' wages wouldn't do it, and all we've got is a #1 fish and bread combo meal from the Galilean food truck that's here by the sea. 5,000 men, not counting women and children. Maybe it was 15,000, 20,000 people. You think about the towns that have that population of 15 to 20,000 people. Imagine somebody finding on the courthouse square on a bench, the whittling bench and the spitting bench outside the courthouse in that town of 15 to 20,000 people, somebody has left a bag from Whataburger with a note on it. In the bag are 2 What-A-Catch sandwiches and 5 biscuits. And the note says, I love this town. This is my gift. Eat up, enjoy. This is for all of you. That's what it would be like to be faced with that situation. It was so little, it was too little. Insignificant doesn't begin to describe it. But the thing was, it just wasn't in the right hands yet. 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish radically change when they get into the right hands. Matthew 14:19 says that taking the 5 loaves, meaning taking them into his hand, and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven. The ESV translates, said a blessing. Literally, the text says, he looked up to heaven and he blessed. And some of you will have translations that in italics supply the word it. That shouldn't be there. I know they're trying to help, but it's not helpful. He didn't bless the bread. He blessed God. He looks to the heavens, he looks to the realm of God, and he blesses, he thanks, he praises God. So he looks to heaven, he blesses, and then he breaks the loaves, gives them to the disciples give them to the crowds. He took, he looked, he blessed, he broke, and he gave. Jesus has said, let me have them and pay attention. See what can be done when small things are placed in my hands. And immediately what was too little to matter fed the population of a small city, with tables still needing to be bussed afterwards and leftovers needing to be gathered. In John chapter 2, we find in John's gospel the first of 7 signs, 7 miracles of Jesus that he records. And Jesus and his disciples have been invited to a wedding feast in Cana. Until looking at it again this week, I had thought Jesus had maybe gone with his mother there. It says that Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding feast, and his mother was also there. A friend of the family, we suppose. Cana was not too far from Nazareth, where Jesus had grown up. And Mary comes to Jesus with the words, they have no wine. And this just wasn't an offhand comment in polite wedding reception conversation that was going on. It wasn't like saying, all the little Smokies are gone. That's just a comment, a disappointing one, when all the little Smokies are gone. But you don't expect anything really to be done about that. What she expresses is a frantic call for action. Running out of wine at a wedding reception was a problem. It was an issue. It was an embarrassment. It was a social tsunami and an etiquette earthquake. It was important enough, and I don't know how important it seems to you, it was important enough to Jesus to do something about. It was important enough to Jesus to, for the first time, according to John, exercise some divine power in his ministry. So there's no wine. Well, what is there? Got scads of water. There's lots of water. He didn't literally and physically take the water into his hands as he did the bread, but it is placed under his direction. It is placed under his control, his discretion. And he instructs for the water to be poured into these pots. Something as common, something as small, if you will, as water becomes the best of wine in the hands of Jesus. Over and over in Scripture, we have this encounter between God and man in which the greatness of God is contrasted with the smallness of man, and God just keeps asking us, what do you have? It doesn't matter how small it is, but what do you have? In Exodus chapter 4, in the midst of the call of Moses to lead God's people out of Egypt, Moses is well into his list of reasons why this is a bad idea. He's already said, who am I to do that? He's already said, what if they ask what your name is? He's going to say, I've never been a public speaker. This is the ruler of Egypt. I'm not your man to talk to Pharaoh. In the midst of all that, at the beginning of Exodus 4, verses 1 and 2, Moses answered, behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord didn't appear to you. The Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? And I can just imagine, in the mindset Moses is in, asking him to repeat it. What did you say? God just asked him, what's that in your hand? It's what was always in his hand. For the last 40 years, as a shepherd in Midian, it was his staff. That's all he had with him. And that's what God says, throw it to the ground. You remember what happens. Becomes a snake, pick it up. This staff, this stick, this piece of ordinary Midianite wood is going to be used for that sign before Pharaoh in 6 of the 10 plagues that are brought against Egypt. This staff comes into play. That's what is used to initiate, to inaugurate those plagues against Egypt, the stretching out of that staff, striking the water of the Nile, striking the ground, holding it out, stretching it out over the Red Sea when they're delivered, striking the rock at Massah and Meribah at the Lord's direction to bring water from the rock. It's just a stick. It's one of my old favorite corny jokes from a kid. What do you call a boomerang that won't come back? A stick. Yeah. So this is just a stick. But in the hands of God and in the God's man, it becomes this incredible instrument of power. Part of the creation is being used by the Creator. In Judges chapter 4, we find the Israelites in this cycle that you find in the book of Judges. They're under oppression again, this time the Midianites. And there's 135,000 of them. Excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. Judges chapter 4, we're back under bondage to the Canaanite king Jabin, who ruled at Hatzor. And Sisera was his general, had 900 chariots of iron. And God's people in the land, they are just outmatched. They have nothing to compare with this. And so they have suffered under Canaanite domination for 20 years. What's it going to take to execute judgment and defeat Sisera, the commander of the Canaanite army who had the 900 chariots of iron? What it's going to take is a housewife, tent wife, more precisely, who had a hammer and a spare tent peg, and I guess one that wasn't being used to hold up the tent, aided by a sleep-inducing glass of milk. And you remember the incredible story. The battle swings against the Canaanites. Sisera, he doesn't go down with the ship. He runs. And he's tired, he's hungry, he's thirsty, he's fatigued. And Jael, the wife of Heber, says, come on in and rest. Don't be afraid. Now, this isn't the angelic kind of don't be afraid. This is the horror movie kind of don't be afraid. When there's everything to be afraid of. Lays him down, puts a rug on him. He asks, can I have a drink of water? Do you one better. I'll give you a nice glass of milk. Maybe sings him a lullaby. And the text says she walks softly into where he was with this spare tent peg and a hammer. And you know the rest of the story. Great article in the April 22nd issue of Christianity Today, bringing a tent peg to a sword fight. And then this quote from Andrew Wilson. The peg through the temple is pretty unforgettable, yet the story also forms part of a recurring pattern in Scripture in which Israel defeats her enemies with tools instead of weapons. In this case, Israel has no shields or spears, but conquers instead with a peg and a workman's hammer. Another judge, Shamgar, defeats the Philistines with a cattle prod. Gideon wins with jars and trumpets. The Philistine king Abimelech is killed by a millstone being thrown over the wall. The second time in 5 chapters in Judges that an obscure woman has crushed the head of a powerful man with a domestic implement. Jericho's walls were brought down by a shout and musical instruments, the sounding of the trumpets. Moses brought the Israelites from Egypt using a staff designed for steering sheep. God, it seems, likes commonplace tools, the stuff of cooking, building, farming, and culture making. Simple things, small things. Over in chapter 7, what I mentioned ago about the Midianites, 135,000 of them, Gideon is called to lead, and he musters 32,000 men. God's response to that is, we're going small. This is going to be small ball against the Midianites. So the 22,000 that I know are already afraid, just send them home. And among the 10,000 that remain, send them down to the water, test them there. I'll take the 300 that survive the test. They can pick up their battle supplies at the pottery barn, in the music store, and torches are us. Just here's your battle shopping list, and everybody just show up at the appointed time. That's where you get stuff like that. That's where you get jars and trumpets and torches. In 1 Samuel 16, it's a sling and a stone. In 1 Kings 17, with Elijah, the drought is already on. This is going to be a 3.5-year drought. Elijah has told King Ahab it's not going to rain until I say it's going to rain. And God sends him to the brook Cherith. He's fed by ravens every morning and every evening with bread and meat, but the brook dries up. I mean, even that brook dries up. So God says, leave the promised land and go to the land of the Sidonians. Go to Zarephath. There's a widow there. She'll take care of you. Well, the widow didn't know she was going to take care of him. Because when Elijah gets there, he asks for water, and while she's going to get him some water, which at least was available, he says, oh, and can you bring me a piece of bread? At which point she turns around and she says, I would ordinarily fulfill that request. I don't have any bread. There's nothing baked. I got a little bit of flour left, a little bit of oil. My plan is I'm gathering a few sticks, going to build a little fire, bake a little hors d'oeuvre for me and my son. We're going to eat it, and then we'll die because there's nothing else to eat. That's all we've got. A little bit of flour, a little bit of oil. And Elijah says, just make me some bread and trust me. Make me some bread, and you'll have enough for you and your son to get you through this drought. And that's the way it is for the next 3.5 years. In 2 Kings 4 with Elisha, it's oil. Elisha encounters a widow of a prophet. The prophet had died, sadly, not only leaving her alone with 2 sons, but also leaving her with a mountain of debt. And the creditors have come, and there's no money to pay them, and the boys are going to be taken as slaves. And he says, what do you have in the house? And she says, there is nothing in the house. Except, and see, that's where we, don't say nothing if there's an except. But that was her mind. There's nothing in the house except just only a little bit of oil. It's all God needs, if that's all you've got. So you and your boys go to your neighbors and your friends, borrow every container you can find. Pots, pans, pitchers, canisters, bowls, Tupperware, Rubbermaid containers. Anything they've got, big or small, you bring it. Get in your house, close the door, start pouring, start filling. And Mom starts pouring and she says, give me another one. And that one starts getting full, give me another one. And when the last vessel reaches the brim, the oil stops. And Elisha says, sell all of it. Pay your debts, and then you got a pension. Pay your debts, and there's going to be enough money left for you and your boys to live on. The model of giving in the New Testament, and Walt, I appreciate your prayer so much about the joyful, loving gifts that we are to bring before the Lord. The model of giving in the New Testament is free will, cheerful, generous, purposed, proportional giving as we've been prospered. Not equal amounts, but equal sacrifice among us. Not equal portions, but equal proportions among us. Regardless of the amount we give, it's not a small thing, not in the hands of the Lord. And we need to make sure that we don't inadvertently minimize what we're doing as we present our gifts, our tithes, and our offerings to the Lord. You know, occasionally we'll still hear someone say, before our collection that it's separate and apart from the Lord's Supper. That might be heard by somebody to mean less meaningful, less significant, or important. That comparatively, this is small stuff, and we know what we're supposed to do with the small stuff, not sweat it. So this isn't a big deal. I think by and large, we've been doing this long enough that most of us aren't going to confuse our gifts and tithes and offerings with being a part of communion, although that might explain the giving habits of some if they thought they were paying for the amount of bread that they ate and paying for the amount of juice that they drank. This ought to about cover it, and it probably would. So maybe we do need to be reminded periodically. And sometimes it's mentioned that, we're just doing this as a matter of convenience. Well, hopefully it's a matter of conviction. Hopefully it's a matter of commitment. And it's okay for your giving to be inconvenient, for your giving to inconvenience you. And I've had to work on this, especially since we've gone to the electronic giving option, which I guess maybe this fall will be 3 years that we've been doing that. At 2:34 this morning, I got an email that said, your recurring weekly donation has taken place to the Broken Arrow Church of Christ. And it takes care of it, 52 weeks a year. If I'm in town, if I'm out of town, if I'm on vacation, if I forget my checkbook, doesn't matter. It happens about 2 o'clock every Sunday morning. But what I used to do when I had a printed check that helped me be in that frame of mind of placing something in the hands of God, before that prayer was offered, I would take the check and I would hold it in my hands like this during the prayer. And I would imagine myself bringing that as a gift and a sacrifice to the altar of God, laying it before the throne of God, like gifts being laid at the feet of the apostles, or gold, frankincense, and myrrh being brought and laid at the manger of the infant Jesus as those wise men came to worship him. And that was just something tangible for me to do. That whatever this is, regardless of the amount, it's being placed in God's hands. And there's no limit on what God can do with that. And I want you, as you give every week, not just to do this, whether you've done it electronically or you got cash or a check, just think about what God is going to do, what you are placing under His direction and within the confines of His will and into His care. The missionaries that money helps support, that we get to partner with and participate in what Rich and Rhonda and Brandon and Katie and Brother V and Feroz do in Cambodia and Ukraine and in India and Guyana. Just the group that's in Ecuador, our participation of them. Most of us will never go there. And yet, as an extension of our church family, we got to participate in that. The medical mission that's leaving this Saturday. People that we will never meet, people whose lives are going to be touched in ways that we may never know. We won't have the opportunity to do that personally, but that's what God does with what we put in His care. The support of our ministry staff and our support staff that allows us to devote ourselves full time to the work and ministries of the congregation. The ongoing upkeep of these facilities that facilitate so many things. Kids care and Vacation Bible School and the food pantry and the clothing room and New Heights. New Heights wasn't even on the radar when many of you bought into a dream and made significant sacrifice to build the outreach center. But because you did, because that was there, New Heights was able to happen. Just housing these kids, working with Contact Church this week is made possible because of that. Time's getting away quickly, and I'm going to try to wrap this up before too long. But let me read a text that I didn't have on a slide from the end of Mark chapter 12. Jesus sat down opposite the treasury at the temple and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums. And some commentators have suggested that maybe with the treasury box that was there in the temple, there was an accountant there. And as people brought their gifts, monetary gifts, their gift was announced. That, Bill is bringing, this offering of this much. And rich people were bringing large sums. And a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow, maybe the amount of whose offering was announced, This poor widow has put in more than all who are contributing to the offering box. They are all contributing out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. And it was almost literally nothing. Just this side of literally nothing was what she had. The 2 small copper coins were lepta. Lepton is the singular, the smallest and least valuable coins in circulation in Palestine. You're familiar with the denarius, a day's wage. This was 1/128th of a denarius. It's what you would get for working 6 minutes. Comparatively, commentators have said you couldn't buy a sheet of paper with 2 small copper coins in our day and age. What makes her gift great wasn't just that it constituted the entirety of her possessions. What made it great was her faith in the one to whom she entrusted it. Her faith in the one to whom she gave it as an expression of her love and devotion. Again, there's literally nothing you could buy with it, nothing you could do with it. So what can God do with a penny? There's been the ongoing debate for years. Why don't we get rid of these things? You can't really use them. Take a penny, leave a penny. Coleman took a penny the other day at a business. I didn't even take it back. I just let him take it. And he played with it. He spun it on the counter, and I owe that business a penny, I guess. But what could God do with a penny like this? Many of you remember back in January, we got a note from a guy. I don't see Rob and Lydia. It came through. It was a message to the Facebook page administrators. And the message read, "Hi, my name is Stuart Tishner, and I live northwest of Henrietta, Oklahoma. Today I experienced my first chemotherapy treatment at St. Francis Cancer Center on Garnett. I was given a lap robe with Philippians 4:13 sewn in the corner. How appropriate." The patch also says, "Tuesday Ladies Bible Class. I'd like to thank them truly from the bottom of my heart. God bless you all. I pray that your ministry will continue to grow and flourish. Stuart Tishner, Copper Cross Ministries." So he sent us a box of these pennies with crosses cut out of them. Linda Wells, you had them for a couple of weeks, letting the ladies in the ladies' Bible class take as many as they wanted. And then it was one of the few times you've gotten to take money out of a contribution plate here. But we filled the contribution plates with them and passed them around, and everybody got to take a penny. Well, that was, it was a wonderful gift from Stuart. Some of you may know that Patrick Edison was a hiker, and that he was in the midst of hiking a lot of the state high points. For those of you who maybe guessed and didn't know Patrick, he was a beloved younger brother in Jesus Christ, just 48 years old, who passed away on June 19th after battling colon cancer, leaving wife Jamie and twins Avery and Reagan. And with David Maynard and James Stevens, and sometimes Seth Parker on some of those trips, they would make trips and hit some of these high points. And they had gotten to, Patrick had done an additional one since he hiked a leg of the Appalachian Trail a couple of years ago. So he was at 16, the rest of them were at 15. But they had this trip planned back in June to pick up 8 more high points. And just looking at the map here, it was a brilliant plan. David and Elaine have been in Texas for a wedding yesterday. They're on their way back. He'll be back to teach his class tonight. But they had a brilliant plan. James, you guys did a great job because there's a little cluster here. They were going to hit Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana, and just kind of make a loop and knock out 8 of those high points. Patrick, for months, had been planning to go. The trip was planned before his diagnosis with cancer. And so David and James and Seth began thinking, Patrick wanted them to make the trip. Patrick passed away while they were on the trip. He wanted them to go. And they started thinking, what could we take to honor him on the trip and leave at these high points? And David thought of the little pennies with the crosses. So he called me and he said, do we have any of those left? I said, no, man, our people emptied those trays. You know, you pass money around and it's gone. So the first night that he taught his class in this series of Sunday night classes, he just threw out to that group there, do any of you have any of those little pennies with the crosses cut out of them? He got all 8 that he needed from that class that night. So number one, I was impressed. You guys kept them, and they were in your pockets or they were in your purse that night that he asked for them. You didn't know what he was going to do with them. They took those pennies over to Patrick's house before they left. They had Patrick hold all 8 of them in his hands. And they said, we're going to leave one of these at each of those 8 high points. Is there anything else we could take? And he thought and he thought and he thought. And finally they remembered, on those hiking trips, he always took dill pickle flavored sunflower seeds. So Avery and Reagan are sent to Quick Trip to buy 8 bags of dill pickle flavored sunflower seeds. And this was at Brasstown Ball, Georgia. And this is Sassafras Mountain, South Carolina. This is Klingman's Dome in Tennessee. Mount Mitchell in North Carolina. Mount Rogers in Virginia. Black Mountain, Kentucky. Campbell Hill in Ohio. And Hoosier High Point in Indiana. And some of those, you could see the penny just a little more clearly. And when I think it was in Indiana or Ohio, there's sign-in books at all these high points. And when they got to near the end of the loop, somebody had signed in the book and basically had said where he was going. He was basically going to be retracing the route that they had just made. And I don't know how long those things stood there, but can you imagine this guy going back to all those high points and finding sunflower seeds? And these high points are hit by people not only from all over the country, but all over the world. I'm not a bettor. I would bet you money that more non-Oklahomans have been to Black Mesa than Oklahomans have been to Black Mesa. Because they got a reason for going there. They got to check another one off the list. They've got to sign the log and put it back in the pillbox. But what a wonderful way to honor him. And you ladies who made that quilt, who may have thought it's just another quilt, didn't know we were going to meet Stuart, didn't know Stuart was going to send us pennies, didn't know you were all going to get one, didn't know David was going to ask for them in a class, didn't know they were going to be all over the eastern part of the country. And those could be in other countries by now. Sunflower seeds, they're gone. They're probably spit along the trail. But the story of those pennies goes on. And maybe one day we'll know the rest of that story. Napoleon Hill said, if you can't do great things, do small things in a great way. I like this, but I would suggest that small things done in a great way are great things. And that maybe we need to rework our definition of great things. Kingdom greatness, worldly greatness, not the same thing. Jesus said, one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. Well done, faithful servant. And this is Patrick all over. Well done, faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. So never think it's only a smile or a hug or a minute of my time or a batch of cookies or a casserole or a sincere question about someone, how someone's doing, and staying there to listen sincerely and genuinely and honestly to their answer. Never think or say it's just a card or a note or a text message or an email. Never think it's only a volunteer role at Vacation Bible School or at New Heights. Never think it's just saying, I missed you, or I'm so sorry about your family's loss, or I'm praying for you. As we've said before, that's not the least you can do for somebody. That's the absolute most you can do for somebody, is to entrust them into the hands of an infinite, almighty, loving, and compassionate God. No small thing when we do these things and place them into the hands of our God. If you need to place your soul in His hands for cleansing by the blood of Jesus Christ, we would love to assist you with that this morning. If you want to be united with Christ in baptism, it would bring the greatest of joys to this group of people, to your family, to the angels of heaven, to God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Whatever needs you may have, please come and make it known while we're standing and singing.